Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into the April 2025 edition of Lote Notes. That's volume 6, issue 2.
That's right.
And our goal really is to unpack the insights on fire safety and security that are in these pages. Think of this as, your guide to the key trends right now.
Absolutely. We've got, 8 articles lined up, covering a lot of ground. We start with the basic science of fire safety,
Right.
then move into things like CFD modeling, that's computer simulations, risk analysis, materials testing, which is crucial,
Mm-hmm.
and then pedestrian safety, vehicle attacks. Plus, we'll touch on the CEO's message and Lote's own values around safety.
Okay, great. Let's jump right in. Article 1, The Science of Fire Safety. How Numbers Save Lives by Joyce Van. So this one talks about a pretty major shift, doesn't it?
It really does. Moving away from those sort of traditional prescriptive codes, the rule book,
Checklists.
exactly, towards methods that are quantitative,
Yeah.
based on actual numbers, actual evidence.
And it uses Grenfell Tower as a key example, right? That
Talk about
terrible fire in 2017.
Yeah, a real catalyst for change. 72 lives lost, largely because of that combustible cladding. It really showed the limits of just following the old rules.
So what are the big advantages of this quantitative approach then?
Well, the main thing is flexibility and precision, especially with modern buildings.
Mm.
Think about innovative designs. The article mentions cross-laminated timber or green walls.
Right. Things the old codes probably didn't anticipate.
Exactly. A standard code might not cover the specific fire risks those involve. Quantitative assessment lets engineers tailor the safety solution to the specific building.
And it mentions quantitative risk assessment, QRA. How does that fit in?
QRA is key. It's about digging deeper than just saying fire hazard. You analyze how likely a specific fire scenario is and what the consequences would be. Like the example they use is lithium-ion batteries in EV car parks.
Yeah, that's a really current issue.
Definitely. A risk older codes might overlook. QRA forces you to confront these things with data. Helps decide where to invest resources effectively, maybe calculating firewater needs for batteries in a data center or smoke management in a huge warehouse.
It's about being smarter with resources, not just safer.
Both, really. Better safety through smarter resource allocation.
And the article suggests maybe if this quantitative approach had been used for Grenfell.
Yeah, it touches on that. If they'd rigorously analyzed the cladding's flammability, how fast fire could spread up the building, maybe question the stay-put policy given that specific cladding, perhaps different decisions would have been made.
It's a tough thing to think about, but important.
Absolutely. The core message is clear.
Hmm.
Using data, using science, it leads to better safety, allows for innovation, and helps focus resources where they matter most.
Okay, let's move to Article 2, Beyond the Flames, How CFD Modeling Predicts Fire Behavior by Dr. Mohammed Ghaffari. CFD, Computational Fluid Dynamics. Sounds, pretty high-tech.
It is, but the idea is actually quite elegant. You're using computer power to simulate how fire and smoke would actually behave, especially useful in complex buildings, tunnels, high-rises, big shopping centers.
Places where predicting smoke movement is critical but difficult.
Exactly. CFD basically applies the laws of physics fluid dynamics to predict the movement of air, smoke, heat, all those gases.
How does it actually work, in simple terms?
Well, the article mentions the Fire Dynamics Simulator, FDS, from NIST. Imagine dividing the building into thousands, maybe millions, of tiny virtual boxes.
Okay, a grid.
A 3D grid, yeah. Then for each little box, the software calculates temperature, air velocity, smoke density, gas concentrations, step by step over time. It uses these complex equations, the Navier-Stokes equations.
Whoa, okay, physics deep dive there.
Yeah, but FDS uses a simplified version for typical building fires, focusing on how heat drives the flow of smoke and air. It's not usually dealing with, like, supersonic explosions in these scenarios.
Got it, so it models the air and smoke movement.
And the fire itself. It simulates combustion, how fuel and air mix and burn. It even models how solid materials heat up, start burning, release flammable gases. It's incredibly detailed.
The tunnel fire case study they mentioned sounds like a good example.
It really is. You can simulate a fire, see how quickly smoke spreads, where visibility drops, how long the air stays breathable. You can even test different ventilation systems virtually to see what works best.
Which is something you just can't do easily with the old prescriptive codes, right? Especially for unique designs.
Definitely not. Atriums, buildings relying on natural ventilation, complex underground structures. CFD provides that tailored, evidence-based analysis. It's vital for life safety, and it also gives first responders crucial information.
But it's not magic, presumably. The article mentions limitations.
Oh, absolutely. The results are only as good as the input data. You need realistic info on the fire size, the fuel load, ventilation conditions. And interpreting the output still needs experienced engineers.
Okay.
It's a powerful tool, but it's one part of the overall fire safety strategy, alongside evacuation modeling and risk analysis.
Makes sense. It's about using these tools wisely.
Precisely. Challenging assumptions, testing designs virtually, and building safer structures based on a deeper understanding.
Okay, Article 3. Risk in Numbers, The Power of Quantitative Fire Risk Analysis by Jack Tetley. This digs deeper into that QRA concept we touched on.
Yeah, this piece really frames QRA as a proactive management tool, especially for high-risk places. Think EV chargers near homes, big battery storage systems, waste facilities, even distilleries.
High-stakes environments.
Exactly. And the article uses a great analogy comparing QRA to forecasting extreme weather.
Oh, okay, like predicting floods.
Mhm. Meteorologists use data on rainfall, ground conditions, etc., to predict flood likelihood and severity. QRA does something similar for fire, using data to assess the probability and potential consequences.
That really clicks. It makes it less abstract.
It does, and it follows a structured process, often using standards like ISO 31000 and risk matrices to visualize the likelihood versus the impact.
So it's a systematic approach.
Very systematic. And crucially, it's collaborative. The article stresses bringing everyone involved, architects, engineers, the building users, regulators together, often in risk workshops.
Why is that collaboration so important?
Because you get all the perspectives. The designers know the intent, the users know the operations, the engineers know the systems, the regulators know the requirements. It ensures the analysis is comprehensive and the solutions are practical.
The waste management facility case study seems to illustrate that. QRA identified a specific risk.
Spontaneous combustion, yeah.
Yeah.
And because they did that detailed analysis involving the right people, they could implement targeted solutions, better monitoring, improved ventilation, real-world safety improvements driven by the QRA process.
So it's about moving beyond just gut feeling or minimum compliance.
Absolutely. It makes fire risk assessment data-driven, systematic. It gives decision makers a much clearer picture of the actual risks, which means they can make more informed choices about where to invest in safety measures. It really empowers better decision-making.
Right. Let's turn to Article 4, Materials Matter, How Fire Testing Saves Lives by Samir Hassan. This feels incredibly fundamental, especially, again, thinking about Grenfell.
It's absolutely critical. This article really hammers home the devastating link between material choices and fire outcomes. Grenfell's ACM cladding with that polyethylene core. It basically acted like fuel.
And the article says Grenfell wasn't unique in that, sadly.
No. It mentions the La Crosse Tower fire in Melbourne back in 2014, the Address downtown fire in Dubai in 2015. Both also involved combustible cladding. It points to a systemic problem, really.
So how does testing actually work? What are the categories?
Broadly, two main types. First, fire resistance testing, or FRT. That looks at how long a system, like a wall or a door, can withstand fire, maintain its structure, stop flames and heat passing through.
Okay, structural integrity.
Right. Second is reaction to fire testing, or R2F. That's about how the material itself behaves when fire hits it, how easily it ignites, how fast flames spread across its surface, how much heat and smoke it releases.
And there are different scales of tests.
Yeah. Small-scale tests give you a basic idea of a material's properties. But large-scale tests, like the AS5113 for cladding systems mentioned in the article, try to replicate real-world fire scenarios on a full assembly. Much more realistic.
The details on the Grenfell inquiry in the article are pretty shocking. Ignored warnings, confidential test results.
It's sobering reading. It highlights failures not just in the material, but in the whole system of specification, testing, and oversight.
And the other fires, La Crosse and Address downtown, they also led to changes.
They did. La Crosse triggered major reviews of regulations and materials in Australia. Address downtown led to stricter rules in cladding replacement programs in Dubai. These tragedies, unfortunately, became drivers for change.
It's not just cladding either, is it? The article talks about fire doors and walls.
Crucial point. Your fire-rated walls and doors are fundamental passive protection. But testing, like that done by BRE in the UK mentioned in the article, found significant issues with fire doors not performing as expected. Even installation matters hugely.
So a chain is only as strong as its weakest link.
Exactly. And the Australian cladding tests they discussed showed huge variations. Some ACPs were highly combustible, while things like mineral wool performed much better. This led to strategies to test existing buildings and replace non-compliant stuff.
So what's the path forward? The article makes recommendations.
Yeah, it calls for really robust testing protocols, standardized procedures, Independent third-party certification, regular checks on installed materials, and continued R&D investment. The message is unavoidable. Rigorous testing and strict standards are essential to prevent these kinds of disasters. Materials truly matter.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. Article 5. More than just bollards. The Future of Pedestrian Safety by Amira Hussein. This moves us outside buildings into urban safety.
Right, and it starts by highlighting how vulnerable pedestrians are, referencing some awful incidents in Australia involving vehicles and schools.
And it suggests the problem is getting worse.
It seems so. The article points to rising pedestrian deaths and links it partly to the mix of transport modes we have now and also the trend towards larger vehicles, SUVs, utes.
Bigger vehicles, bigger risks for pedestrians.
Potentially, yeah. More momentum, bigger blind spots. It adds complexity.
So what can be done? It's not just about bollards, as the title says.
No, it's a much broader strategy. The article lists quite a few things. Physical barriers like traffic islands or raised medians for safer crossing.
Refuge areas.
Right. Improving visibility with things like parking restrictions near crossings, curb extensions to shorten the distance. Traffic calming is big too, like those 40-kilometer zones in cities.
Do those actually work?
The article cites data suggesting a significant drop, like 33%, in serious injuries in those zones in Australian cities. So yeah, speed management helps. Also things like chicanes.
And technology.
Smart crossings with motion sensors, better LED lighting, countdown timers on signals, even broader urban planning concepts like grade separation, physically separating pedestrians from traffic.
That sounds like a big undertaking.
It can be, yeah.
Yeah.
But the article also raises a newer challenge: electric vehicles.
Because they're so quiet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Pedestrians can't rely on hearing them approach, so we need more vigilance, maybe more visual or audible signals at crossings, plus public education.
And it mentions smartphone distraction, too. Pedestrians glued to screens?
Yeah, it's a significant factor, apparently. Around a third distracted. So it's about infrastructure, vehicle design, and pedestrian behavior. It really needs that multifaceted approach the article calls for.
Okay. Next is Article 6. When Tragedy Strikes, How Vehicle Attacks Are Changing Security Thinking by Ryan Perkins. This addresses a really grim topic.
It does. The increasing use of vehicles as weapons in ramming attacks. Easy access, potentially devastating impact. It uses the New Orleans attack from New Year's Day 2025 as a recent tragic case study.
14 deaths, 57 injured. Horrific. And the article suggests security failures were a factor.
That's a key point it makes. Apparently, funding had been allocated for hostile vehicle mitigation HVM, things like bollards, but they weren't properly implemented or even deployed. Portable barriers were in storage. A police car inadvertently created an opening.
So having the gear isn't enough if it's not used correctly.
Precisely. It underscores the need for robust planning, implementation, and operational readiness, not just buying equipment.
And it contrasts New Orleans with other cities.
Yeah, places like Münster in Germany with permanent bollards, or Melbourne, which redesigned public spaces after their own tragedy to integrate permanent HVM. Proactive, planned security.
The article also brings up electric vehicles again, but in this context.
Right, their silence, potential weight, quick acceleration. These pose new challenges for security risk assessments related to vehicle attacks. Security thinking needs to adapt.
So the call is for stronger security frameworks.
Yes, integrating HVM, but also real-time surveillance, rapid response plans. It's about making urban spaces as safe as possible from this specific threat while trying to keep them open and accessible, a difficult balance.
Which leads nicely into Article 7, Designing Safer Cities, Balancing Accessibility and Security by Jed Hugill. This tackles that exact balance.
Yeah, how do you put in pedestrian-friendly security without making places feel like prisons? It looks again at New Orleans post-attack, where they put up more barricades, expanded pedestrian zones, used removable bollards on Bourbon Street.
Removable bollards, how do those work effectively?
Well, they have locking mechanisms, usually underground. They can be raised for security, like during events or at night, and lowered for vehicle access when needed. But as the article stresses, they need to meet proper standards, like ASTM or ASNZS standards, for vehicle impact resistance to actually work.
But there's a risk of making places feel unwelcoming, right? Too secure.
That's the concern. And this is where clever design comes in. The article talks about multifunctional HVM, using things that provide security but don't necessarily look like security.
Like what?
Architectural planters, robust ones, reinforced steps or seating, even sculptures or fountains designed with HVM principles in mind. Figure 1 shows planters. Figure 2 shows sculpture use in Sydney.
So integrating security into the streetscape design itself.
Exactly, making it blend in, serve multiple purposes. It shows that effective HVM doesn't have to be ugly or intimidating. You can balance security with creating vibrant, accessible, inclusive public spaces. It requires thoughtful design.
That leads perfectly into the final article, number 8. Painting bollards across Melbourne, exploring the intersection between art, resilience, and security by Hashim Naya. This sounds like a really interesting take.
It's a fantastic story, actually. It goes back to Melbourne after the 2017 Burke Street attack. As we mentioned, they rapidly installed over 200 concrete bollards.
Purely functional at first, right? Speed was the priority.
Totally. The premier at the time said, no time to be wasted. Aesthetics weren't the focus initially. They were just plain gray concrete blocks.
But then the community stepped in.
That's the amazing part. Residents just started painting them, decorating them, turning them into art installations spontaneously.
Wow, so these symbols of a tragedy and of security became something else.
Exactly. They became canvases for community resilience, for individual expression, for art. It transformed these utilitarian objects into symbols of strength, unity, and Melbourne's identity as an artistic hub.
That's quite powerful. It didn't erase the reason they were there, but added another layer.
And the article notes that more recent HVM installations in Melbourne have paid more attention to aesthetics and convenience from the start. But that community response to the initial bollards is a really unique example of how security and culture can intersect.
It shows that security measures don't have to stifle a city's spirit.
Not at all. They can even become part of its evolving story.
Okay, before we wrap up, just a quick mention of the CEO's message from Dr. Maher Mughrabi.
Right. It really emphasizes Lote's growth, linking it to their team's experience, client relationships, and focusing on outcomes.
And he stresses human connection even with all the AI developments.
Yeah, and highlights achieving ISO 27001 for information security, alongside their ISO 9001 renewal for quality. It underscores a real commitment to standards and continuous improvement in everything they do: fire, security, risk.
Plus, mentioning the team's involvement in key projects and industry events, HR summits, security summits, fire safety events.
It paints a picture of a company that's actively engaged, focused, agile, and really committed to improving safety and resilience, driven by its people.
And this really connects back to Lote's core values, right? Specifically, safe and secure.
Absolutely. Everything we've discussed today, the deep dives into quantitative analysis, CFD, materials testing, urban security, vehicle mitigation, it all reflects that commitment in practice. Their expertise and focus on collaboration shines through as being central to creating safer environments.
So, pulling it all together from this deep dive into Lote notes, what are the big takeaways?
Well, we've seen fire safety getting much more sophisticated, moving towards data-driven analysis and advanced modeling like CFD.
And the absolute critical role of testing materials properly that came through loud and clear.
Definitely. And on the security side, it's this evolving landscape for pedestrian and urban safety needing multifaceted approaches, balancing security with accessibility, dealing with new threats.
And even finding space for art and community resilience within security measures.
For me, that Melbourne Bollard story is really memorable. How people took something stark and infused it with creativity and resilience. That, or maybe the sheer power of CFD to let us see a fire unfold virtually. Pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And for you listening, understanding these things isn't just for the experts. If you live or work in a modern building or just walk around a city, these are the kinds of issues being tackled to try and make things safer. It gives you a sense of the progress and the challenges.
Which leaves us with a final thought, perhaps. As our cities and technologies get even more complex, how will that balance between accessible, open spaces and necessary security continue to shift? And what part do we all play as individuals in building safer, more resilient communities?
Good questions to ponder. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.